Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the strange and unusual literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to focus on a short story of interest from a Black author because it is Black History Month. And I have a bit of an interesting one for you today, one that is about protest and social justice, at least that's what it seems. I am referring to The Marchers by Henry Dumas, which was published in 2003 in the posthumously published short story collection Echo Tree. A quick note, I found that it was hard to do like a cold open for this specific book because there's things discussed, but I didn't really have a way to do a cold open, so I figure why not just do a mixture of cold opens and the traditional intro, and that's the way that it seems that I'll go forward from here. If you have anything to say about that, let me know in the comments. But for those who don't know, Henry Dumas was a Black American writer who lived in the mid 1900s. He mostly wrote short fiction, at least one book, and some poetry as well. And after he died, Toni Morrison remarked that his work was pretty good. Like she said he was very underrated, which is high praise from Toni Morrison, another high quality Black writer. So Dumas, wrote about the Black experience and whatnot. But unfortunately his life was cut short as he was at a train station when he got gunned down by the police because they mistook him for somebody else, presumably. At least that's what the popular opinion seems to be, and that's in line with what happens to a lot of Black Americans, and it always brings to mind the call for abolishing the police and repairing or just dismantling the justice system entirely, which I fully agree with. So that's a pretty good example of a Black author who was probably cut down in his prime. And probably had a lot more art to deliver to the world in some way. I'm really happy that I found this particular writer, this is what, Around the Weird is all about, especially with this short story today. It's very abstract, very allegorical, and I'm not really sure I completely understand what Dumas is talking about here. But without further ado, let's talk about The Marchers. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Marchers focuses on both prisoner and some activist. It focuses primarily on a prisoner in a white dome prison. It's described as a white dome prison. And he's either been there for centuries or there's been silence about this prison for centuries. It's not entirely clear what Dumas means when he's talking about that. But the story also talks about the protesters who are marching to the prisoner, who are encouraged by their leaders to fight an injustice that has taken place. The leaders give a bunch of speeches where they talk about not only the prisoner, but also the injustices that have existed for these people in this land in the past. And they are met by both police and soldiers who are trying to stop them from getting to the prison and getting inside of it and doing whatever they're trying to do. But despite these obstacles, they are able to free the prisoner. But the prisoner is very disoriented when they come out into the light. The heat of the sun, they're thirsty, and there's also just the general noise, which is slightly alarming for this person who has been in a cage for quite some time. But they're still pretty happy that they got their freedom. And as the story comes to a close, the prisoner, the leaders say that the prisoners should be grateful that they have their new freedom. But the stand, the sort of stage that they're standing on breaks apart and the prisoner falls, and he's just very disoriented by the mob that is gathering, and also the heat of the sun. It's a little bit too much for them. And the narrator in particular notes, as the story comes to a close, that the white dome is still standing underneath the sun, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about with the Marchers, even though it is a relatively short story. One of the themes that Dumas seems to be talking about is the fight for social justice. People everywhere come together for the prisoners' cause. They gather in their communities and are united by various leaders, and they're pushed towards marching on this prison that's there under the White Dome, and advocating for the release of the prisoner. But this also seems to be part of a larger social issue, as they're talking about a number of other inequalities and injustices that have taken place in this society. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "Remember this, you have served in the fields, you have served in the kitchens. In the warehouses and the factories you have shed your precious blood for this nation, and all the time you could not even enter the front door of the house like a man. But today we will knock on the door, and with the arm of the Great Spirit we will open the door, we will enter, we will sit down at the feast table, and we will rest and nourish ourselves." And that's a pretty fascinating quote, because it gets at the maybe the true concern that the marchers, the protesters, and the leaders all have, that it seems like the prisoner is just, like they're experiencing one problem of an overall unjust system. And so they're coming together to protest everything and finally be seen as equals in society. Very much reflective of what Black Americans have gone through, and what Henry Dumas experienced himself with a justice system that so often failed people of color. And like on a larger scale, like America not treating Black Americans or people of color in general as equal in any regard, in any sort of facet of the system. But of course, with this protest, you get pushback from soldiers and police, who are tools of this oppressive police state, as we see in our own system, whose job it is to sort of undermine these protests and sow discord and make it so that these people aren't united. It doesn't seem to work here, but that's what happens when the people who are doing the oppressing don't like that these people are gathering and actually voicing their concerns. But it should be noted that for all this social justice, the prisoner is uncomfortable, that they might be focused on the spirit of protesting more so than the needs of the prisoner. I don't quite know what exactly it means that the prisoner is uncomfortable. But it should, I'll get to more about that later, but it's clear that Dumas is exploring, the act of fighting for social justice and how protesters might be more engaged in the protest spirit than focusing on maybe what's around them, or the people who might be feeling the true oppression or something like that. Or a question posed by the marchers that I think Dumas is trying to get you to think about is, what does the prisoner represent? The story seems more allegorical than anything else. So the prisoner is a symbol, I think, in this story. Maybe not an actual prisoner, but more a concept, more representing something that that Dumas is trying to get at. And so you could argue that the prisoner is more representative of the minorities as second-class citizens thrown into jail and then, ignored for an extremely long time, and the protesters and the prisoner are those second-class or minority citizens rising up and asking for their rights, or demanding their rights, in fact. And that seems to fit with what Dumas is getting at. But you could also argue that the prisoner is the justice system itself. Long ago, put into a corner, put into a prison, forgotten about. And what you get now is not a justice system at all, but more a means to further oppress people of color. Put them in prison, make it so that they can't get out, or that they're stuck on parole, that recidivism is an all-time high because you need a prison labor labor force because you're not allowed to do slavery anymore. And there was a report that came out pretty recently, as I'm saying this, that showed that a lot of companies are engaging in this prison force in order to make some more money or save some money or whatnot. And the prison system often relies on people of color. And so you can see slavery is kind of alive and well. We just given it another name. So the prisoner could represent the justice system, or it could just represent the common person. Rather this being a story about race, this is a story about all the oppressed people, the working class people who are oppressed by the proletariat, and they're coming together to save the idea of the common person, and then rise up against those oppressors, rise up against the bourgeoisie, and so this could be more of a socialist message or a communist message from Henry Dumas, more so than anything else. Again, it's a bit unclear if that actually fits, because Dumas doesn't really make it clear who or what the prisoner is. No matter how you look at this story, the answer isn't easily revealed. And I do think it's meant to be questioned and kind of debated and explored, but ultimately it's hard to come up with an answer, because there's so many different facets of society that are unjust, and so maybe the prisoner can fit in all of those rather than a single one. It's also important to talk about the ending to the story, because I think it's a pretty fascinating sort of ending. Dumas leaves a lot kind of hanging there for you to question. One question I think arises is, what does it mean that the prisoner seems to be ignored by the mob? And actively, further disoriented by the mob. And I think what that means is that, sometimes the mob forgets why they're protesting in the first place, or forgets the small, individual person in the grand scheme of the massive injustices that they're protesting against. And so, that could be a commentary on social justice and the act of protesting and being an activist right there. But then there's another question that arises, what does it mean that the dome is still standing? The narrator goes out of their way at the end of the story to say that the dome is still standing. It's still a white dome under the sun, and the prisoner is still black, which is an interesting way to phrase it. But I think what that means is, again, in the act of protesting, you might be angry and try to save people on a smaller level, but you're not thinking of the macro level. You're not thinking of the system at large that has allowed this prisoner to be in prison for so long, that has allowed these injustices to take place. And so it might be easy to focus on those smaller issues, but the dome is still standing at the end of it. This prison is still standing. And so if you don't focus on the system, then this unjust system will be allowed to continue. You haven't really fixed anything in the grand scheme of things, which is a very important message to send. It's important to focus on the main problem rather than the symptoms, rather than the side issues. Those are important, and we should definitely help people when those come up. But Dumas is saying, focus on the prison. Don't just let it continue. You have to, or else this will be a problem for future generations. And ultimately what Dumas is saying is that activism needs to be more. You can't simply focus on those smaller issues, and you have to remember why you're fighting in the first place and the causes that you're fighting, or else it's not really smart activism. And I feel like I see that a lot, especially with the Women's March that took place during the Trump years. It seemed to be a big thing, but once Biden got elected, people stopped protesting that much in that way. I think there was that sense that, we're protesting a Republican, and then once a Democrat gets elected, we're not really protesting. So activism does need to be more. And I feel like there are activists, especially people of color, who are doing a great job. But I think this might also be like a sort of commentary on white protesters as well. And there's a lot that can be discussed there, but I'll probably have to talk about that another time. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Marchers by Henry Dumas. A pretty solid short story, one that I enjoy, but I do feel that it can be vague at times. And it's really hard to particularly narrow down what Dumas is trying to say, because his message is a bit muddled here and there. I get the overall point, but what exactly he's trying to say, it's too abstract in my opinion. Still a pretty solid short story, and I definitely recommend that you go out and read it. I'll put a link to it in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have any thoughts about the review, I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about the Marchers or Henry Dumas if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and prisoner-freeing travels. Farewell.